Next, we'll talk about transport through plasma membranes within cells and passive versus active transport. Passive transport occurs without the cell's energy, where active transport with the cell's energy. An example of passive transport is diffusion, the movement of molecules from high to low concentration. This occurs when there's a concentration gradient, where there's a difference in concentrations in and out of the cell membrane. This can be demonstrated with an angle here, and if there's a high concentration here or high elevation as a comparison, or low concentration or low elevation, then by natural forces substances move from high to low, whether it's high to low concentration or high to low elevation by the forces of gravity or diffusion. As an example, in a cell, if we have 60% of a concentration on one side of this membrane, that would be our high, and 40% on the other side, which would be our low, substances will move from the 60% to the 40%. In cells, simple diffusion is an example of passive transport, such as what would occur in your lungs or across blood vessels like capillaries, where a gas like oxygen would move from high to low concentration from the 60% to the 40%. Osmosis is an example of passive transport in cells, where diffusion of water through a selectively permeable membrane causes water to move from, say, 80% across a membrane to 60%. Facilitated diffusion is passive transport of substances like ions that are charged and can't get through the phospholipid bilayer. In this case, through channel or carrier-mediated transport or diffusion, ions travel through a membrane, protein, which is what facilitates the actual process. Lastly, filtration is passive transport where substances move across a membrane under pressure. Active transport requires the cell's energy. Protein or solute pumps are an example of that, where substances are moved against a gradient rather than along the gradient from low to high concentration. Another type of active transport is carrier proteins, where a large molecule will be carried through the cell from one side to another because it's too large to go through a channel or any other opening in the cell. Two other processes of active transport would be endocytosis and exocytosis, where in endocytosis substances move from outside the cell into the cell, and in exocytosis substances move from in the cell out of the cell. This is an example of hormones being released from a cell, or digestive enzymes, or other processes that require energy to move large substances across a membrane. Cells inside and outside have fluids with a solvent water and solutes. The conditions where the amount of water and solutes inside the cell are equal to those on the outside of the cell is known as the isotonic condition. When there's a higher amount of solute inside the cell than outside the cell, and a lower amount of water inside the cell than outside the cell, this is called the hypotonic condition. And based on diffusion, water would then move into the cell where solutes would move out of the cell, and could result in what is known as the lysis or splitting of the cell. If the concentration of solutes outside the cell than inside the cell is greater, and the amount of water inside the cell than outside the cell is greater, then water would want to move out of the cell, whereas solutes would move into the cell by diffusion. And this is known as a hypertonic condition. And could result in the shrinking of the cell, known as crenation. The results of the movement of substances in both hypo and hypertonic condition is having equal amounts of water and solutes in and out of the cell. This is back to that isotonic condition, or what we call equilibrium, when the process of homeostasis is reestablished. Two other processes of transport that require energy is endocytosis and exocytosis. The movement of substances into the cell from out of the cell is endocytosis, as in what's called pinocytosis or cell drinking. Exocytosis is when substances move through the cell membrane out of the cell, as in the examples that we talked about in protein synthesis. So at the bottom here, proteins are being forced through the membrane